So I would like you to meet Dr. Jeffery Werner. He is a wildlife ecologist with the BC government and an adjunct professor with the Department of Ecosystems Science and Management at the University of British Columbia. Jeff's work focuses on how human-caused changes to forested habitat can influence population dynamics of resident wildlife. This presentation will focus on how our treatment of forests may help or hinder the fate of moose in north central BC. Jeff combines aspects of systems theory, risk management, and human behavior to expose deeply held myths about resource use sometimes creates barrier to responsible wildlife management. And I'm just going to add one little piece here. Please recognize what Jeff's role is tonight in this presentation. I know that moose is on the forefront of everyone's mind, particularly with the proposed changes to 7B. And so recognize that Jeff is not a policymaker here at this particular moment. He is a presenter here. So Jeff, I'm going to have you take things over. Glad you joined us. Thank you so much for agreeing, especially on a Saturday night.
Oh, well, actually, thank you for the chance to speak with you. The first step, I guess, we need to accomplish here is I need to share my screen and make sure this works. So let's start with that, shall we?
You bet. I have set you up now.
Okay, so can I confirm that you guys can see this?
Confirmed.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks a lot for a chance to meet with you guys, but also to discuss two things. First, some research findings. That's mostly what I do. Some research findings and results of some ongoing efforts to I guess, benefit moose populations, both in terms of their size and their health in north central British Columbia. My hope is that this talk will provoke some discussion. I'm also aware that there's a great number of wildlife experts and enthusiasts on the call today. There's a lot of knowledge in the room. And so I'm actually kind of looking forward to the discussion because that's my opportunity to learn from you. But certainly my goal here is to influence your opinions about perhaps what you think wildlife need in forested portions of the north. Now, my area of competence is something called population ecology. And that's an area of scientific research that focuses on trying to answer two related questions. The first is what drives the distribution of wildlife? And by that, I mean, why are some wildlife here, but not over there? And then related to that is this question of abundance. Why are some populations doing really well over here, while other populations of the same species often are doing very poorly over there? Now, nearly all of the important discoveries that we've made in population ecology have actually come from studying small creatures. And so, you won't, and there's a reason for that. That's because of their short generation time. So you won't be surprised to learn that I've spent most of my career actually studying creatures like the Vancouver Island marmot on the left, a very endangered species on the island, and on the right, one of the more common parts of all northern ecosystems, which are Arctic ground squirrels. Moose, on the other hand, live longer. And for that very reason, and the fact that they have fewer offspring, we're about to see that we sometimes have to use a very different kind of thinking and a different kind of logic when we try and answer questions about distribution and abundance for these large longer lived species. Okay, so what's the plan? We're actually going to cover a lot of ground, and I don't, although we often give quite a few talks a year on different aspects of our research, we rarely ever try and push so much into so little time. But I'm potently aware that I'm not going to be asked back to give 8 more talks. And so although really the human brain can only kind of take 5 or 6 things before you start to forget, in 12 minutes, information is going to start leaking out of your ear. And I'm sorry for that, because I will continue talking for another half hour after that. I just want to get some of this work on the record, because this is my one chance to share with you some of the results of many years of research and habitat enhancement. So we're gonna start by taking a very quick skate across the pond of what moose are experiencing throughout North America. And then we're gonna focus on and address moose health. We're gonna look at food quality. We're gonna talk about food quantity, the use of chemicals in forestry, how warming temperatures might be exacerbated by different kinds of forest management. And then we'll end on a high note, hopefully, by then introducing a habitat enhancement project, which is intended to bolster populations. So the bad news is you're getting a lot of information. The good news, of course, is that you're all absolved from having to remember any of it. And so you can just lean back now knowing that you're not really on the hook because it's just too much. One of the controversial scientific theories of the past few decades has nothing to do with moose management or environmental management, really, except somehow I've got a slide of it right here. It connects the functioning of our individual brains, so basically our physiology, to the behavior of modern society. Now, I might be going out on a bit of a limb here, but this theory, just to give you the background, really begins with the premise that inside your head, there are 2 brains and not one. It turns out that in many ways, this is true. Your brain is redundant. You have 2 hemispheres. And if you cut the cord between those 2 hemispheres, they continue to operate independently. A lot of research over the last little while has called attention to the fact that these 2 hemispheres, we'll call them left brain and right brain, actually have very different personalities. They actually have very different worldviews. And some researchers are now starting to contend that the prominence or the power struggle between those 2 halves of your brain can shift one way or the other. And it's affected by culture and your local environment. And the left brain excels at making rapid judgments. This is the fight or flight part of your mind. It relies on rules, on procedures, in today's world, on a lot of technology to kind of simplify the world and in many ways to try and manage it to our benefit. Now, on the other side, the right brain is a lot more to do with subtlety, with nuance. This is where you recognize humor, where we use metaphor, logic, and critical thinking. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, we're increasingly occupied by a world of our own creation. This is one that caters to the left brain. And some people are starting to claim now that the built environment that we live in, the urban environment that we live in, and the kind of large scale sort of agro way that we do everything from agriculture to forestry to transportation is promoting the left brain over the right. This is a world of relative simplicity, of roads, rigid lines, right angles. This is, in some ways, the creation of the left brain gone wild. Now, the problem, and here in forestry, I could talk about this for a long time, but the way we do forestry in British Columbia is also very left-brained in my mind. The problem is that the rest of nature, and by nature I mean for the sake of today's argument, habitat for wildlife, it's not arranged like that. That's not the kind of pattern that we see. It's actually things like fractal geometry, like the 4 photos at the top of the screen, all examples of self-replicating pattern. Nature is full of complexity. It's so important, actually, that we ecologists have coined a special term for it. It's at the heart of our understanding of the principles of ecology, and it's called heterogeneity. It's just a fancy word for variety. But this is actually a really important thing, because as we're going to see, the way we've been sort of left brain treating and managing what we call as resources is resulting in a simplification of nature, which is not to the benefit of many wildlife. So, ecosystems have some very important characteristics. The whole science of complexity has identified 3 really important ideas about ecosystems that I should just mention. One is this idea of stability. Complex systems are buffered, so you can kind of push them with whatever it is, forest fire, climate change, what have you, and they tend to be resistant to causing permanent change. When they do undergo change, we've all heard of this word resilience, and resilience is about the capacity for an ecosystem to bounce back. And then lastly, a very important and in some ways dangerous concept is this one of thresholds, of tipping points, that there are sort of stages at which, if we push an ecosystem too far, you can result in irreversible change. So getting back to this idea of complexity, it's probably the single most important feature of any healthy ecosystem. And it's often measured using a concept called the natural range of variation. The premise, of course, is that, for the last 10,000 years, all of the species that occupy our forests have evolved to make use of all of the varieties of structures of species, of forest habitats, of processes, of rhythms. And that if we are going to manage nature in a way that maintains all of the collective species that we really care about, we have to be mindful of making sure that we don't go beyond the bounds of what would be considered the natural range of variation. Now, unfortunately, our style of forest management today actually does the very opposite. It's making our ecosystems more vulnerable to fire, to drought, to insects, to climate change. And surprise, surprise, many of our wildlife are probably expected to suffer if we continue down this road, this kind of left-brained approach to management. Now, speaking of moose, that is the purpose today. There are a lot of ways of trying to explain what moose need, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a half hour when we get into our discussion. But if we were going to put this really simply, moose need 3 things. They need to eat, they need to avoid being eaten, and they need it to make it through tough environmental conditions. For example, a really bad winter. I'm here to convince you that these 3 criterion can be translated into metrics of habitat. And I think that translating things into a physical understanding of habitat is really important for 2 reasons. First of all, it moves us away from what we often call the proximate causes of population declines. A proximate cause is the immediate cause, okay? To use a controversial example, most people would say or tell you that the proximate cause of declines in caribou numbers throughout the province are wolves. I'm going to argue that dealing and trafficking in proximate causes is very tempting. We as biologists and as government employees love to do it, but it's also a huge mistake. And of course, it's changes to habitat that are causing predator-prey dynamics to be out of whack. And if we want some long-term solution to our problems of predators and prey, it has to do with habitat. Now, that brings us to the second thing, which is that, you know, translating our environmental problems into inspections of habitat help us then conceptualize things like limiting factors and to recognize that there are these tipping points, these thresholds that we talked about before in ecosystems, where the role of one factor or another, you know, increases or decreases. So how are moose doing, by the way? Well, by all accounts, looking at trends throughout their range in North America, over the past 10 to 15 years, there are a lot of populations in decline. And from that, we might surmise that there are a lot of populations who have experienced a change in one of those three conditions that they need: to eat, to not be eaten, or to survive harsh environmental conditions. I would just draw your attention to the fact here that many populations in Eastern Canada are in decline. So it seems as though central BC here, which is highlighted in red, is in a sense in good company. One of the few places that I've found moose populations to be stable appears to be in the Yukon. And I think there are actually some very interesting reasons for that that we could discuss at a different time. But when a lot of populations of the same species do the same thing in different areas, that spatial correlation, as we call it, often suggests that there are some big picture problems with the species as a whole. Now, if we were just to drill down here into British Columbia and ask ourselves, okay, well, how are things here? We see several things. First of all, at the top left pane, that picture of British Columbia with the gray and the red, those are trends by management unit. If you're red, that means that you have a population growth rate that is negative or shrinking. And if you're gray, you're stable or increasing. That top pane is the decade before 2005. The decade after 2005 to 2015, in the bottom left pane, of course, shows what everyone is really screaming about, which is that moose populations almost everywhere in the province are in a state of decline. The top right graph is the decline in hunter harvest over a 50-year period. And that bottom center graph with the 5 circles is my region, the Prince George region. And that's the population that Mike Morris mentioned earlier this evening, that's had somewhere between a 70 and almost a 90% decline since 2005. And this is the population that I'm doing a lot of work on right now. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, we're not completely sure, although in some ways I'm here to try and convince you of something. But some interesting trends are emerging. One of them is encapsulated in these 2 pie charts. The top pie chart is for British Columbia, province-wide. You slap a collar on an adult cow moose, and then you follow its fate. When it dies, you try and get there in time, and you say to yourself, okay, why did you die? And so cause-specific mortality rates in this part of the world, in British Columbia, it seems as though about 1 out of every 5 adult cow moose dies of something nebulous that we're going to call health related. And if you focus on just the Prince George region, it's even a greater fraction. Now, I'm showing another pie chart on the bottom right. Why this one? Because last night I managed to find it on the internet, and because it shows something similar. It exemplifies a pattern that we see in much of the continental northern US. This, I believe, is from Montana. And in Montana, they're finding that fully more than half of the deaths that they witness are health related. Now, some of you might be scratching your head. I mean, this is not kind of the classic thing that we learn about when we think about ungulates, especially animals just falling over dead. And second of all, we know that it has to be an underestimate, because if you're sickly, there's probably a better chance that you're going to get picked off by a predator. So these are only deaths where predators were clearly not involved in the cause of the mortality. So predator deaths are going to be hiding an even larger fraction of animals which are suffering poor body condition or poor health. When I started working for government just a few years ago, I was tasked with this kind of head scratcher. I was told, Jeff, we want you to look into this strange thing of what we're calling apparent starvations. And that's largely the research that I'm going to focus on and display to you today have a lot to do with that issue. Okay. So we generally believe with all large, slow-living ungulates that adult female survival and the survival of their calves are the two most important things which actually control the size of a population. Today, we're going to focus on some of the habitat changes as the ultimate cause of this. Now, when we think about moose habitat in central BC, we're inevitably going to think and talk about our response to the mountain pine beetle. It was more than 3 decades ago that 2 government biologists pointed out something that we really ought to have always known, which is that rapid overharvest, and by overharvest here, I'm talking about forests. So rapid logging followed by the establishment of monoculture pine plantations is going to lead to a set of conditions that are sort of like boom and bust dynamics in the supply of forage and of cover. And this is exactly what our sort of left-brained management response to the mountain pine beetle did. And that's exactly what our resident moose populations did as well. They behaved as predicted. You can't log a massive area in a short period of time and then not have some really important sort of habitat supply issues coming out of that. One of those issues has to do with food quantity. So we all intuitively know that cut blocks have plentiful shrubs, and they do. But the problem here is that those same cut blocks, we pound, 1,600 stems per hectare in there. They're designed to achieve crown closure very fast. So while the supply of forage is good for the first, say, 12 to 15 years, what happens over the next 80? Now, moose are also, sorry, let's go back here for a moment. Moose are also particularly sensitive to forage quality. And, when we drive around in our trucks around Prince George and view the landscape, you know, we see a lot of what looks like moose food. And I have to tell you, it's hard to imagine moose dying of what we're calling apparent starvation with what clearly seems like so much food kicking around. But, you know, that ought to tell us that there's something about our assumptions about the way we're seeing the world, which is incorrect. Moose are particularly sensitive to forage quality. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, they eat twigs. Now, I myself cooked chicken last night. I wouldn't last a moment on twigs. But speaking of chicken, it's protein that's especially limiting for moose diet. And this paper and these papers here subsequently really kind of broke open the fact that that protein is a limiting factor for moose in the north, but also that plants also, you know, really want to hang on to that protein. And so boreal plants have evolved all kinds of defenses, ways of protecting those protein portions of their leaves and stems and to avoid them from being eaten. I'm about to make a very short case here for the fact that I think we see a major source of forage quality in central British Columbia. And the logic starts with this. First of all, we know from the collaring programs that we have now a lot of evidence of apparent starvation. So that's definitely something that's happening. As is, we're starting to see a lot of the collared animals which are maybe not dying but are in very poor body condition. Now, if we couple this with the fact that we know that nitrogen is a limiting factor, and nitrogen is what makes protein, and that moose too are therefore limited by or see protein as a scarce resource. And then just a few years ago, I noticed something very strange when using pellet density surveys to get a sense for habitat use in specific regions. And what I found is that moose are avoiding the interior of very large openings. In fact, we find most of the evidence of habitat use within 50, 60, definitely within 100 meters of a forested edge. But now, of course, some of these massive clear cuts can be 500-600 hectares in size, and we don't have any rules stopping corporations from just logging, you know, 5 or 6 of these massive clear cuts side by side until you have one sort of mega clearing. And we're starting to see these mega clearings of 10, 12,000 hectares up around Prince George with not a lot of evidence of moose use. Now, this sort of forced us to start thinking about forage quality, and we realized that we needed to study it. And so what you're about to see here are the findings of a study on the nutritional landscape. So what I did is I gathered plants from under the canopy of natural forests, but also from these large clearings near the edges and then way out in the open. That red line is the protein content that an adult female moose needs over the long term to stay alive. And so we're going to start here by looking at some lab analyses of Bebb's willow, very important moose food. This is crude protein. I want you to notice that there is a U-shaped pattern to the data. And the highest protein contents, the one labeled South Forest and North Forest, those are in natural primary forests, some of them old growth. And of course, the south edge, north edge, and open areas, we see a reduction in protein in these young clear cuts. But, and you know, looking at this, it seems as though maybe that doesn't matter because it's all above the red line. But it turns out that one of the sneaky things willow and other plants do is they take excess energy from sunlight and they convert it into tannin. And tannins reduce the palatability and they bind to the proteins so that digestible protein contents, what a moose actually experiences is much lower. And so what we see here now is that the only foods that I would say constitute moose food, in this case, would be under the natural forest conditions, and certainly not in the clear cuts. And this is just to show you that when we measure the tannin concentration, the blue line, and those digestible protein, the pattern mirrors itself, suggesting that the one is causing the other. And so, I did this for a number of species. Here's a sample of subalpine fir, dogwood, fireweed, and again, willow. And in all of these cases, to more or less of a degree, we're seeing these same kinds of pattern where some habitats are providing better food than others. Okay, and there is another interesting indirect method for assessing range quality, and that's to actually collect and measure fecal nitrogen. And this is what I did to take a look at how moose are experiencing these same habitats during winter, because the study I just showed you was for summer. During the winter, by collecting these pellets deposited in snow in the late spring and then sending them to the lab, what we see is that large clearings are representing lower range quality than interior forests. Okay, so we now know that many moose populations are declining, that life as a twig eater is a real challenge, and that forest management can lead to decreases in both the amount of food in the long term and the quality of that food in the short term. We're now going to move to another controversy, and that's the use of chemical herbicides. This is also a very common practice in my region, in the Prince George region. If you want to know where Prince George is here, you just have to take a close look at the largest blotch of red in the image to the bottom right. That I did not do that mapping, nor did anyone in government. I actually reached out to a fellow who works with Stop the Spray because I noticed they'd already mapped this out. That, I believe, is all of the evidence of glyphosate applications since we started keeping record. Okay, so thinking about something like a chemical that we drop from helicopters to manage moose foods kind of out of existence, I wasn't really interested in thinking about quantity, because we already know that spraying cut blocks is going to reduce what's available for moose to survive on. But I've been interested in this idea of risk and how we can formulate risk in a way that helps us think about glyphosate in particular. Now, risk in the literature is defined in a very elegant way as, in this case, the probability of exposure multiplied by the severity of that consequence. And we can sort of further decompose this. Probability of exposure really has to do with how long it persists in the environment and how much of it we use. And of course, on the other side of things, issues like toxicity or changes in forage quality would influence the severity. And by multiplying these two together, we can kind of start to think about risk. I'm not going to get into this except to say that there's been a recent explosion of science looking at what people are calling the impacts of chronic low doses of glyphosate for a whole range of risk factors. And I'm actually involved in some research ongoing right now that's looking into this exactly through UMBC, but it's too soon to talk about. But this has caused many of us to question these previously held beliefs about the safety of this chemical for wildlife, but also for humans. And so we recently asked two very, I would say, practical questions. First, how long does this stuff last in the environment? And second of all, I was interested in knowing how it might affect forage quality. we focused on a number of plants important to humans and to wildlife, and collected plants in both a northern, and by northern I mean sort of around Chetwynd, and a southern area which is around Prince George, in order to capture changes in climatic variation. You'll see in a moment why we did that. The design for a study like this is what we call a treatment control design. So we collect plants 1, 3, 6, and 12 years after glyphosate has been applied to that cut block, as well as to untreated areas for comparison. When you're out there collecting your plants, I can tell you there are some obvious physical changes that you see to the surviving plants right away. Now, let's just, in the interest of time, jump to the results. And this is a decay curve for two chemicals, glyphosate and something called AMPA, which is a derivative. If glyphosate breaks down in the environment, it sometimes turns into AMPA, but they're both equally toxic. And what we're seeing here, first of all, let me remind you that, you know, in the literature, and also, you know, as suggested by, I think, the federal government, glyphosate is safe, and it's safe because it breaks down in the environment within 72 hours. But what we're seeing here with these curves is that after a single application, we can see concentrations 1 year later, which actually exceed the legal limits for human consumption if, say, for example, a blueberry was to be sold in a grocery store. When we look at this graph, we see that after 12 months, is about 95% of all the samples we collected were still contaminated. And half of all of the samples were still contaminated 3 years later. We even found detectable concentrations in a few samples after 12 years since application. Okay, these graphs just break this down, and the light gray graphs are for a northern zone, and the darker lines, are for a southern zone. And all that really you need to take from this, I think, is that climate matters. And the further north you go in the drier, colder ecosystems, glyphosate seems to last longer in the environment. Okay, so we have answered this first question, I think, about persistence. Does it persist? Yes. And, you know, thinking about how long it lasts, I would say that there's probably a significant amount of this stuff still floating around in plants in clear cuts, say 2-3 years after application. So if you sum up those for the Prince George region, that means that moose are potentially exposed to, well, almost 15,000 hectares of what you might call contaminated land on a yearly basis. Okay, so we've answered that first question, but the second one is, how do the plants that survive, how do they respond? There are some reason to believe that plants that, you know, get the proverbial shit kicked out of them, if you will, but survive the spray, could imagine that they, although plants don't think, so apologies for sort of positing that kind of language here, but they may respond as if they had been attacked by, say, insects that defoliate them, other natural predators that they have an evolutionary history dealing with. And a lot of these plants deal with these attacks by reinvesting in compounds which make them poisonous or less palatable, etc. So I wanted to know, would protein, for example, be lower in treated plants that survived? And would energy be lower or higher? So did we find a predicted example with protein? The short answer is actually no. What we find here is that for, so what you're looking at are 3 graphs of red osier dogwood, firewood, and willow. The black squares are the treated samples, and the open, clear squares are what we would expect normally if we had never sprayed. So what we see is the difference between them, those three red arrows, are suggesting that in all cases, 1 and in some cases 2 or 3 years after we spray glyphosate, there's actually an increase in the protein content of those plants. And then eventually they drop back down and follow the natural conditions. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, what about energy? The opposite seems to be the case here. There's not a really strong response early on, but then suddenly, look at that. You know, somewhere between 4 and 12 years after, in all cases, all 3 species, the treated, the dark data points are all lower. So there's less digestible energy available in blocks that have been sprayed than if they had been left alone. So why should we care about this? Well, to understand that, we have to reevaluate that calculation of risk. So because something here that I never told you, I've just been pulling my punches because we don't have a whole lot of time, but glyphosate is known in certain concentrations to be toxic, yes, but also it has this interesting impact. It's a microbicidal effects. So it can kill small creatures, and as we'll see here in a second, that's potentially an issue. Also, thinking about risk and the probability of exposure, we had thought the stuff might last in the environment 72 hours, but actually now we're starting to see that the probability of exposure is 157 times higher than previously thought. Now, large ungulates, if they target these plants that contain more nitrogen, that contain more protein, they're also targeting plants which are rich in glyphosate. And the direct consequences here, we don't know. We haven't studied this yet, but I'm worried about animal digestion. This chemical alters gut microbiomes. We know that in insects, in bees, in humans, and in some wildlife. Now, moose, of course, these badass twig eaters, have 4 stomachs and a very complex secondary fermentation system in order to convert those twigs into usable energy. So the open question we have now is, to what extent could we be messing with the digestive systems of ungulates? Okay, it looks like we're halfway through, but we're actually a lot more. We're going to move quite quickly now. I'd like to speak to you on another aspect of habitat that has to do with heat stress. Now, owing to their size and their surface to volume ratio, their really thick coat, and the fact that moose are not able to sweat, these animals are a classic northern cold adapted species. They have the lowest, what's called critical temperature of any other large ungulate. And that critical temperature is just a fancy way of saying at what temperature do you start to feel the effects of heat, and at what point do we need to start thinking about it in terms of thermal stress. Now, why care about this? Well, warmer temperatures are implicated in changes in behavior, in documented health issues. From my perspective as a population ecologist, I'm very interested that some researchers are seeing changes in reproduction and survival that are linked to mean annual temperatures. And in some areas like southern Ontario, people are starting to think that it may be causing population collapses. So, not trivial. But the question here is, are our local temperatures potentially under management control? In other words, could they be controlled by the type of forest that we grow in the landscape? Now, to answer this question, I recently put about 150 what are called black body temperature loggers into a variety of forest types for an entire year. And we're not going to talk about this. We used statistics to tease apart the forest stand characteristics, which seem to, help explain the mean temperatures as well as the frequency if we count out the events where a temperature exceeds that threshold and we call it stressful. You might ask, well, how do we know what's stressful? Well, there are some published thresholds in the literature that tell us that during wintertime, moose start to feel the effects of warmth in an uncomfortable way that affects their nutrition and their ability to use energy at about -5 degrees. So they're already stressed at that point. You get above 0, you're in that red line, that's acute stress. And during summertime, those two thresholds are 14 degrees and 20. Let's just jump to some of the results. This little fancy graph here shows you, I don't know how many thousands of measurements taken once every hour for an entire year, night and day. And if that data point is blue, it means no stress. If it's yellow, moderate stress, and if it's red, it's a major problem. Now, this graph here, I'd like to draw your attention to two things. First of all, where I've highlighted in green, look at how the bottom just falls out of that. So in month 4 to 5, so April, May, even in a 180-year-old old growth spruce stand, there was hardly a moment where that moose in that year was not experiencing some form of heat stress. This tells me that late winter, early spring is actually a really critical period for moose, something I had not previously appreciated. Now, the last thing to notice here is that the hottest recorded measurement in this old growth forest up here was, I don't know, 26 degrees. Now let's look at a young managed landscape, a 21-year-old spruce stand. Some pretty interesting differences here. Again, month 4 and 5, April and May, seem to be sort of a really critical time. But when the hot temperatures really hit, now in this case, and I can explain to you why, because some of you are going to say this is impossible, but the black body temperature recorded for this young plantation in August was 47 degrees, almost a 20-degree difference. Now, this graph on the left is just to tell you, don't worry, I'm not pulling the wool over your eyes. This is just the weather station data, the black dots, and the bars are the 40-year average. And so this just tells you that the year I did this study was not some sort of freakish year. In fact, it followed the long-term average very well. Now, the graph on the right is the proportion of each month that was not stressful. So the higher the bar, the better. And what I just want you to notice is, again, that April and May were the months where life is pretty tough for moose in north central British Columbia. When we create these statistical models, we find that crown closure, elevation, and something called biomass, forest biomass, I'm going to talk to you about it in a moment, are the most important variables explaining mean annual temperature. And when we just count the frequency each month where things are acutely stressful, we see crown closure and biomass are the two important variables. And when we just focus on those critical months of April and May, we find that it's just biomass that is explaining the most of the variation. Biomass is like forest volume. So the higher the biomass, that will be the larger the forest. By virtue of that fact, you're looking at sort of older productive stands. And this is just two ways of measuring variation. It doesn't really matter except to say that we can graph these over biomass, and we see this positive relationship where the greater the forest structure, the more you are getting towards classic, shall we say, old growth, the less variable the temperatures are in those stands. I would also like to note that the differences that I observed between old mature forests and the differences that I saw between that and those younger plantations are much greater than the predictions that scientists globally are saying we're going to experience over the next century for climate change. I think that's profound. I mean, it means that we can do worse in some ways right now than what we may experience over the next little while with a larger global problem. Okay, so what are the takeaways here? You know, all these study sites seem to experience periods in the year where moose would be very stressed. Moose are very vulnerable during the early spring, and of course that's maybe the one time too when they may or may not, depending on breakup, be able to access riparian or wet habitats to cool themselves. Certainly in April, with the exception of this year, that's usually not the case. Not all sites are the same. Forest matters, and mature forest, of course, does the best job at providing what we might call thermal shelter. And so in that sense, you know, a lot of the fate of moose and the stress they experience, yet again, has the potential to be strongly influenced by the way we manage, hopefully not in the left brain way, our forests. Okay, so at this point, you're probably thinking, jeepers, this is depressing. Is there any good news? Well, yes, in a way, I think there is. And in the last few minutes, we're going to take a look at that. But first of all, and by way of explanation, I need to remind us all about another, it's a very abstract concept, but just bear with me here. Let's see if we can get through it. The fact is, populations kind of regulate themselves, and they would have to, otherwise everything would go extinct. And so what that means is that when a population size is very large, its rate of growth tends to be very small. And when the population is very small, the rate of growth tends to be hopefully very large. This is an idea called population regulation. Now, since I'm a population ecologist, you give me data like this, of course, I'm going to do the analysis. So what I have here is for the Prince George South region, we have something that scientists call a density-dependent response. And this is a very complex graph. You're just going to have to take my word for it for the moment. But what this says is that there are three sort of potential dots. The green dot is a stable one. So, and that's where the moose population is now, at a very low density, about 0.5 moose per square kilometer. And if we have a bad winter and the population decreases, the rate of population growth will be very high and it'll go back to that 0.5. But if it gets bigger than that, we have the opposite problem because it tends to want to go back to that low stable state. The red dot is an unstable point. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Why I'm even showing this to you is to get to the last point in this talk, and that's about the good news. Habitat manipulation, in theory, can help us get out of this because these curves can be manipulated with good forest management. And so what we want to do is to push this curve upwards, because if we can do that, then what happens suddenly is that yellow dot becomes a green one. And it used to be. There was a time when we had a green dot up there, and moose were at about 1.4 individuals per square kilometer, and that's in theory what we want to get back to. Okay, so this is what we're trying to accomplish with some very large-scale habitat enhancements. So when we look at these maturing forests, forests that are somewhere between 20 and 80 years old, there's a couple things that you're going to notice. Two specific things. You look at your feet and you see no moose food, just like these photos, because there's not enough light and because the needle cast is so high that nothing down there grows. And that's on purpose. We foresters love to create these types of stands because they're growing very fast. Now, if you look up and look into the canopy, you're going to see for a very long ways dead branches going right up the stem. Again, that's on purpose because the canopies of those trees are moving upwards always, and they're very small. The problem is that moose winter range requires two things: food and forests with large structural trees with architectural branches that can intercept and hold snow. Otherwise, when we get a big snow year, moose can't have got nowhere to yard up to, and things go sideways really quickly. So what's the solution? Well, in the Dominica region, we're trying to take really high density plantations that look a little bit like this. Of course, you can tell I don't draw very well, but I did spend an hour last night copying and pasting little dots. We want to take a stand like this and turn it to something like that. Specifically, the purpose of this project is to create small gaps. So you mow down all of those crop trees, and then we walk away, and we're going to let succession take over. Hopefully, we're going to get broadleaf species back in there. We're going to get moose foods. And the second thing we do is what's called juvenile spacing. And that's when you alter a stand so that it develops and promotes these architectural crowns capable of intercepting and holding snow. And we're doing this by being very mindful of roads. Now, we just don't have time to talk about this, but road densities are one of the major problems with wildlife today. There's a critical threshold of 0.6 linear kilometers per square kilometer of road density. If you go above that, you start to see large vertebrates drop out of the system. That's 0.6. In Prince George region, I think we're at 1.3. So not great. So we're very mindful of roads, and we try and buffer them. Any kind of habitat modification we do is spaced off of them. So I broke up an area that we call the PG South, massive area south of Prince George, Vanderhoof, Fraser Lake, into hexagons, analyzed them, identified which stands were young enough and were candidates to be treated. We're going to zoom in on one of these hexes, 14 kilometers in size, which we did last winter. And let's take a small tour. So this is 1/5 of a hectare. The photo was taken in July. It was cleared earlier that spring. On the other extreme, here's a 2-hectare gap. Everything's mowed down, and now we'll just hope that willows come and take it over. Now, using variable spaced thinning, this is all done with large machines, by the way. Here's what a 400 stems per hectare looks like. By the way, we used a variety of targeted sort of tree densities between 2 and 6. And here's what a 600 stem per hectare looks like with some nice coppicing willow already coming up last spring. And of course, every time we do anything that's this large in scale, we have to be responsible. And for me, that means we need to set it up in a kind of an experimental way where later I'll be able to report back to you with statistics and graphs and say, listen, it worked or it didn't. And so Again, we have these treatment areas, but also these untreated controls, and we'll have to study them as well. Look at the vegetation growing in there, pellet plots in there, etc., so that we have a comparison to make. Earlier last spring, when we just started, somebody flew over in a helicopter counting moose, and they saw our first initial attempts at this enhancement. Here are some thinning treatments and 2 different sized gaps. Okay, so to summarize this part of this talk, just to say that you know, complexity matters, and we need it if we want wildlife. And so far, the best thing we've come up with for trying to bring some complexity back to these severely homogeneous managed landscapes, it's really sad to see, but is the use of thinning and gaps to do most of the work. And then succession, it will take over from there. That's the end of this talk. So to wrap up everything here, I'd like to just remind you of 6 things. First of all, the threats to moose are many, and populations throughout North America, some of them are in real trouble. In BC, we have some populations which are in very dire straits. You know, a large proportion of these health-related deaths points to factors like food and also heat stress, for example, as affecting their physiology and really just causing some major problems. Now, I don't think herbicides are a cause of declines, but certainly it's an aggravating factor. And we were quite surprised to realize how stressed out moose are because of heat, and how important some of these older forests are for providing thermal refuge over time. Certainly, if we want to benefit moose, the one lever that we absolutely must pull is a change in the way we do forestry. And that's that. So thank you very much for your time. Now, Amberly, would you like me to stop sharing? I think that probably makes the most sense, yes?
Sure, yes. I have to say, I'm blown away. I'm a farm girl, and in horses, you know, I've studied nutrition quite extensively, and in one of the things that I've learned to do over the years has been hay analysis. And I can pick an unirrigated hay analysis out of a crowd in just studying, you know, the fiber and the protein and things like that. So when we start to talk about you know, forage quality and things like that, you know, what we see when we visually look at the hay is not necessarily reflective of what's in the hay. So in fact, in you know, in our domestic animals, we have we overfeed high quality forage, and we don't focus enough on poor quality forage. But of course, we have those choices, and moose don't, obviously. So you know, what an excellent presentation, and you're a great presenter. You're just so easy to listen to, and you know, your manner of speaking is really good. For everybody that's here, I'm going to be opening this up to Q&As, and I have Wendy. So Wendy, I'm just going to find you here and promote you to panelist. And I know in Wendy's area that there's not a lot of forestry or industrial activity, and yet moose declines are still occurring.
Okay, I'm here. I vanished and then I came back.
Good job.
Very interesting topic. I'm a plant person, so yeah, very, very interesting. I'm not not a horse feeder like Amberly, but I'm very much into plants. I had a question. Is the April-May stress caused because the moose are still in their winter coats and they're shedding?
Yeah, that's correct. That's what we believe. There is a little bit of uncertainty here in the fact that, so much, as you know, of science, it's a science is a team sport, right? It's a collective effort. And so, you take your small drops of water and you put them in the ocean of all the other thousands of people that are studying something similar. So, and we borrow from each other. So I have relied heavily on some of the only published studies of molt and the timing of molt and all of that from Alaska to make some assumptions about when moose are tolerant to different temperatures. But I didn't do that myself. And so I'm using the published literature, and then I'm making my own temperature measurements and then squaring them against that. So there's always a little bit of uncertainty there, but certainly that's the cause.
Okay.
And we are seeing that the starvation events, when a moose collar stops, you look at your computer and you're like, that moose hasn't moved in 3 days. And then you go there and it's not eaten and it's lying on its side. And that often happens in late spring.
Yeah, when they're really stressed. And I had sort of a comment. I live in Kelowna, but our guide outfitting territory is 100 miles south of the Yukon border. And I've had the privilege of flying from Kelowna to camp in small aircraft. And the pictures you show is the southern half of BC. You get north of Fort Ware, and we're in, I would say, pristine habitat. There's no industry, there's no roads, there's no forestry, and there's still no moose, because one of the 3 things that moose need is in the north is we have heavy predation, because that's the trigger in the north. So your study really makes a lot of sense for south of Fort Ware, where all the industry is, but we need to also remember that our moose are in trouble where there is no industry. And that factor is predation. And I think it's actually a factor province-wide because they don't have the habitat to live in. They're getting starved and eaten at the same time. I think they're missing 2 in the southern part. But anyway, it's very, very interesting topic. Thank you very much.
I'll just make a very small comment, and it's not my intention to pick a fight with you. And I hope you know that, my job, both in the way that I've been trained, but also as somebody that does science, we have to be humble and we have to be honest. So I'll always start by saying, I don't really know, but everything we do know about predator-prey dynamics, wolves and moose have co-evolved for a very long time. And, I spent 10 years in the Yukon working and doing research up there. So I understand what pristine ecosystems look like. I hear you, and I study predator-prey dynamics up there. But there's a functional and a numerical response, is what we call the 2 ways that predators change. And it's based on the number of prey, because predators actually, they're there at the grace of the prey, if you will. You can't have more predators than the prey base supports. It's impossible. So I totally understand, that predation is a concern. And I also think that when we see predation getting out of whack, it's almost always comes back to some insidious change to habitat.
Okay.
Thank you for that. I know that you know, that for some of our northern people that you know, it would be very interesting to be able to understand a little bit more about what those factors are. I mean, you know, I think sometimes, you know, because we have air conditioned rooms and heated homes and things like that, that we may not recognize just those moderate or minor temperature changes, as opposed to, you know, the ones living outside and how they might perceive it. You know, I wondered too, in the heat stress of April and May, is coming off of lean winters going to increase that stress that is felt in those animals if they have a lower body condition in comparison to, you know, say a summertime? James, I have James here. Welcome, James.
Oh, thanks for hosting this talk. Amberly, right?
Yes.
Yep, right on. Awesome talk, Jeff. Really enjoyed it. I grew up in the PG South area there, and you know, I'm always shocked. Like a lot of these pine areas, you know, because of the treatments, the glyphosate, and not just the spraying, but also brushing with manual brush saws. That whole expanse of landscape should be just huge patches of aspen everywhere, aspen and birch. It should, you know, like you fly up there. I don't go over there in an airplane, but in a drone, you know, it says monotone olive green of lodgepole pine. And, you know, it should be totally different. It should be mixed with a ton of deciduous forests all through there. And if you look at places that they logged in the 70s, that's exactly what it is. They're probably 80% aspen with spruce and subalpine fir and a lot less pine. You know, I guess just the one comment, I do have a question, but also a comment is just, you know, we would have a huge amount of superior moose habitat across this landscape if we had not been spraying and brushing for all these decades. Matt Scheidemann there at UNBC, he found with radio color data that the moose preferred the aspen forests in every study season and every study area. You know, so it's like a forest type that they gravitate to. You get a lot of understory vegetation in the aspen patches, so that would help with the shaded browse. You get better quality forage under there. Do you think like the lack of aspen, or I mean, we've probably lost in that area, I mean, a couple 100,000 hectares of aspen in the last 20 years. So do you think we should be maybe being a little more specific with, you know, when we talk about bad forestry, like, isn't like the suppression of aspen, wouldn't that be one of the key things that we need to kind of correct? And it's an easy one too. It doesn't cost us any money. Just as an example, you know, where your project there is south of Bobtail Lake. I mean, Canfor is in there brushing. Like a few kilometers away, they're cutting down birch and aspen in cup blocks that the moose are feeding on, that we have evidence of. So, I mean, we're still like working at cross purposes with each other. I just feel like the whole aspen and broadleaf forest thing is kind of not really getting talked about. Anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to say. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it, especially the temperature stuff. That's super critical.
I totally agree with you. I have no, you know, I don't take umbrage with anything you said. And certainly, I guess, just in the interest of time, I'll say two very short things. First, I was surprised when I joined government about how it was structured. It is structured in a way where sometimes the left hand and the right hand are not always talking to each other. And so, you know, it's partly my job to speak to my colleagues who work on the forestry side to say, hey, these are the influences you're having on our wildlife. That's my purpose. So that's happening, but I'm not a decision maker. Obviously, I'm a scientist. Second of all, totally agree with you about the importance of aspen for many reasons, especially in the region that you're talking about. And we know that nutrient cycling is better. And one of the points of the research I've presented today is that, you know, almost all of life is only composed of 4 things. You got oxygen, you got carbon, you got hydrogen, and you got nitrogen. That's like 99% of what you are is made of. But the last of those, nitrogen, it comes in 2 forms. One is organic, and it's very rare. And the other is inorganic, and it's useless. And we don't get organic nitrogen in this earth without fixation from bacteria. So it's something that happens very slowly, and it's something that once it has happened, you know, you really want to keep that organic nitrogen around. That's what fertilizer, of course, is basically all it is. And so that nitrogen cycling is really benefits from aspen. So yeah, if we could have more aspen around, I believe we would have much higher forage for wildlife in terms of quality.
Thank you so much. So, you know, as we're just chatting for a little bit here, I've started to promote just some of the audience up to panelists in case people just want to candidly make some comments or engage in some discussion, stuff like that. So, you know, for those of you that are still watching, you know, have a look at your screens to see if you can accept being promoted to panelists, but I'm just going to open up the floor to at least those that are here now and invite some comments.
What about me?
Oh, Robin. Robin's got his hand in the air. I missed that. Sorry, Robin.
Okay, I was fascinated right from the start, keeping in mind that my right brain should punch my left brain in the mouth. But I know some of the earlier graphs were about populations. Some of the staggering declines, I noticed Alaska, British Columbia, I think the other one was Nova Scotia, were pretty alarming. So as for managing our wildlife in British Columbia, and if we're going to discuss moose, everything is based on very, very rough estimates. So 20 years ago, we had a very rough estimate of 180,000 moose in the province of BC. Based on those graphs, it's safe to say that we should be roughly around the 90,000 moose in the province, which is pretty consistent with estimates. How will we benefit from more accurate inventories in some of these regions? When you discuss with Wendy Carey about in the north part of the province, where we don't have the higher road densities and the poor forestry practices, we still see declining moose numbers. So inventories, the importance of them, and obviously they're very important for your work.
Okay, I wish you hadn't asked that question. It's a great one, and I'm gonna respond honestly. But I have to preface this by saying I have opinions. They aren't always held in common with people I work with, and certainly I'm not in any way speaking on behalf of government, okay? I need to make that very clear lest I get fired. So as somebody that's, you know, spent the better part of 25 years studying wildlife and trying to disentangle all manner of problems like this, I have to tell you, no, I don't think that we need to be counting animals out of existence. I mean, you could say for a lot of the species that are endangered, you know, Jeff, should we count caribou? No. Should we count owls? No. Why? We count only when we're committed to some kind of experimental intervention. So if we're going to do something about an endangered species or a declining species, if we're going to get in there and say, okay, let's, I don't know, manage predators or increase habitat or set aside land that we know is important for moose or some other species, then we should be counting to see whether and to learn from our efforts to do a good job. But just to count for the sake of counting, to me, that I see no, and this is as somebody that, you know, my bread and butter is, you know, taking annual population censuses and calculating intrinsic rates of change. We learn a lot that way, but there comes a point where counting is not enough. And but for example, we're all very much committed to trying to count over and above any kind of helicopter surveys in the regions where we're doing those very large scale habitat enhancements, because that will tell us whether we've done a good job, whether it's working. But sometimes I feel as though we throw money at counting, because then you can say you're doing something, but that's not doing something. Not necessarily anyway. Does that make sense?
I do find that it does make sense. I guess that's my left brain. Say in a lake or a river, we will measure the river at its lowest point and measure the river at its highest point. For wildlife, we should measure the wildlife at its lowest point and its highest point, and it will set the bar for us to use as a comparables. But I do understand what you're saying. Yeah, should we count them to death? No, I think I was just more concerned about our direct knowledge of inventory of these larger animals like moose. I know you mentioned, you know, 0.5 moose per hectare versus I think it was 1.1 or 1.2. So I think when we're looking at, or per square kilometer, sorry, there is some counting going on, and I understand the reason why for it.
Counting is important, but especially when it's coupled with sincere efforts to change the habitat conditions for the species that we count. I guess that's all I'm really trying to say.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. I thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Scott Ellis.
Thank you, Amberly and Dr. Werner. That was outstanding. You are very articulate in the way you outline what our challenges are. So I really appreciate it, and it gives me a lot of faith in FLNRO, or now I'm not sure where you land, Minister of Forests, or you know, or Ministry of Forests is you know, what things look like in the future. In your study area, you know, you put some stats up about, I think it was 0.4 moose per square kilometer. You know, in what do you think, if the world was according to you, you know, what would be carrying capacity be in that region? You know, so smaller cut blocks, no brushing or little brushing, no aerial spraying, you know, and maybe changes to free to grow and or whatever else, so that we actually have other values on the land. You know, what do you think that the density of moose should be or could be as a reasonable level?
Okay, so here's one of the problems. The world's changing all of the time, and populations are often under the control of one or two factors more than other factors, but that changes over time. So let me tell you a fairy tale, because I don't know if it's true. But let's imagine a place far, far away called the Prince George region. There was a time when moose were not very plentiful. These were times when there was not a whole lot of forestry yet. The landscape was dominated by sort of mature to late seral forests. The populations at that time were in sync, in a sense, you could say in harmony with carrying capacity, but the carrying capacity was much lower. And the reason for that was because moose were probably maybe food limited in terms of quantity. They had all of the winter range they needed. They had all of the thermal refuge they needed, more than they needed, but they didn't have enough food. Now, fast forward, 60 years, you've logged everything, even notwithstanding the fact that I'm showing that there are some changes in the quality of the food, and that in the future we may actually see a reduction in the quantity. But it's hard to argue that food is like the major thing right now, because there appears to be so much of it. I'm going to suggest to you in this fairy tale that moose are no longer food limited, but they may be limited by something that wasn't once 60 years ago, like the supply of thermal habitat or good winter range. So answering your question is hard, because you need to find the right balance of all of those things. Is that a fair answer? I'm not trying to be evasive. I guess I'm saying I don't really know.
Well, you didn't give me the answer that I was looking for, but I do understand exactly what you're talking about. And so we get that there's climate change, and we get that, that there's been a lot of forestry activity that has changed, and that this continues to change. And then you layer on top of that the complexity of things that I don't know, maybe we haven't had before, whether those be heat domes and whatever these new rivers are, and or different climatic changes. So I guess I'm trying to figure out as we go through this. I agree with you with your 3 points. So yeah, thank you for what you do, and thank you for your position. And I think we have the ability to do a better job and grow more moose. And I would hope that one of the things that this will do is help educate a lot of folks. And we will continue to push for objectives and more moose on the landscape. So thank you.
Well, we often get this overused metaphor of that certain species of bird in the coal mine, right? And miners used to bring that thing down, and if that bird fell dead, that was an early warning sign that all was not right. I'm kind of worried, because I think that moose, they're no canary. They're like bringing a crow in down the coal mine. Those things are tough. And in fact, by the time the crow dies, probably all the miners are dead. So in some ways, when moose of all species are in this much trouble, one could say that, we've got an ecosystem in disarray. And so that's the way I see it now.
Neil.
Yes, thanks, Amberly. Yeah, just an excellent presentation, and it shows us, I think, the complexity of what's going on. It seems in wildlife, it's always a number of things interacting at the same time to create this perfect storm. For the moose, it's exactly opposite of where we wanted to go. It's a perfect storm of their destruction. I think as a comment, it's just I'm a forester. I've worked all over the province, and I get frustrated too that we seem so quick to try and blame it on one factor, and that factor, it seems to be oftentimes is used as the glyphosate use. And I guess the question I have is that I see moose populations declining in roughly equal proportion in other parts of the province where there's no glyphosate being used. And has there been any research on that? And And is it possible? And it's just it's the lack of complexity of these stands and the reduction of aspen through just monocultures and high planting densities. So is it possible? It has nothing to do with the glyphosate use. It's just the structure of the stands that we've created. That's the first, I guess, question. And the second question is it also possible that we see a lack of use of much of the landscape, i.e. the centers of cut blocks more than 50 meters away from the timber edge? Maybe it is to do with protein, but is it not possible that the way I see it is the moose will not go out more than 50 meters away from the edge of the security cover because they'll be shot? And I've just seen that time and time again in places like the Elephant Hill Fire, which is, you would think is some of the best habitat that could have been created by a massive 200,000 hectare wildfire. It's almost void of moose simply because I believe that they cannot set foot out in there without being shot, or maybe possibly by predation by wolves. So do you think we're missing the concept of vulnerability as being one of the factors? I'll cut it off there and listen to your thoughts.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, the way I heard you, you said three things. You said, you know, we got this issue as an example with fire. We've got this issue of how moose interact within and with a clear cut. And then we've got this issue of glyphosate. So let's tackle those separately. First of all, for the comment with fire, I would just make the obvious comment right away that the fire is a natural process and an important one. And when we're thinking about other species, especially, the death of a tree is the beginning of its importance ecologically. So dead trees are wildlife trees. And so salvaging wildlife trees is not a recipe for good wildlife management. So right there, I just want to make that point. And related to that is the fact that forestry and fires do very different things.
Right.
So they look differently. It's a totally different kind of habitat. There is a bunch of research showing that moose are sensitive in fires, old fires, to their perception of predation risk because they're constantly looking around. So they will behave a certain way. But we also know that large fires, as they mature, are some of the most important old burn habitats for moose in places like the Yukon. So, they have an important role to play as long as we don't salvage them. Now, in terms of how a moose behaves in a clear cut, yeah, I mean, I think that you're probably right. Moose are probably fearful of going too far out in the open because that's a really risky thing to do. And there's no cover out there, especially with these mega clear cuts, these mega salvage blocks that we're seeing in my part of the world. There are no rules, right? As soon as you get to salvage something, then all of the few laws we have under FERPA and policy guidance for what a cut block should be in terms of size and what it should look like gets thrown out the window.
Yeah.
And it's rape and pillage. And so we have these massive openings. And yeah, I think you're probably right that on top of the fact that the food's not so great out there, it's just a risky place to be. Yeah. And then the last thing, glyphosate, I don't know. For sure, it's adding insult to injury, right? I mean, I think we would all agree there. Is it a driving factor behind moose population dynamics? I can't tell you, it's too soon to say.
Yeah.
But I know for sure that it's doing us no favors.
Yeah, for sure. Appreciate that.
Sorry,
Jordan.
Yeah, you mentioned there, Jeff, being the heat stress, the critical times being April to May. Just wondering if with the snowpack and the less feed, possibly in the older growth and the cooler timber in that time of year, would they maybe be facing more heat stress being forced to go out in the open to forage. Because I noticed I live more down in the south or end of the province, and during the spring bear season I get out quite a bit, and I've noticed time to time again a fair share of moose being right out in the wide open in these clear cuts that time of year. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that, or what you found.
So I've been focused the last few years very much on trying to understand the importance of habitat for sort of determining population dynamics. The spatial orientation of moose at that time of year would be best answered with collar data. And so I mean, that's a very specific question and a good one. But to answer it, I would first have to take a look at the collar data and get back to you. It's not something I can, I don't feel comfortable making up a guess, but it seems to make some sense what you're saying.
Okay, thank you.
Folks, any more questions and answers out there? Well, for a late start, we rolled it out awfully good. I tell you what, Jeff, again, your presentation style is just some of the best that we've had, and I'm excited to bring you back. So you can count on us being an annual invitation to do this again, and we'll try and not tie you up on a Saturday night next time.
It's very kind of you. Thanks so much. And if you feel as though there's a need to for any kind of follow-up, feel free to. I mean, my email's publicly available anyway, so please feel free to pass it on if need be.
We sure will. We sure will. And you know, keep us in mind too. You know, if there are, you know, we talk about advocacy and we talk about supporting, you know, wildlife and things like that. If there are things that you can ask of an organization such as ours, whether it's carrying forward a message or seeking support for, you know, research and stuff like that, do think of us, because you know, I think I speak for all of us. You know, our swamp donkeys are really important to us, and they're an iconic species, and certainly, you know, the declines are significant and alarming.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the chance to speak with you, and like I said at the beginning, I mean, I totally recognize that there are those of you among us that know a lot more about moose than me, and so yeah, thanks for your patience.
It was great. It was great. I have nothing further coming from the crowd, so I am going to thank you on behalf of Hunters for BC, everybody that's participated today, our AGM, and then Mike Morris, and now Dr. Jeff Werner, and we will see you all again. Have a great night.